Next, we have Amplify the Voice of Nursing Through Social Media with Robin Cogan. So, Robin is a nationally certified school nurse. She is currently in her 19th year as a New Jersey school nurse in the Camden City School District. She serves on national boards, including the American Foundation for Firearm Injury Reduction in Medicine, or AFIRM, the Gun Violence Prevention Research nonprofit organization, and the National Board of Certification for School Nurses. Robin is the legislative chair for the New Jersey State School Nurses Association. She is proud to be a Johnson & Johnson School Health Leadership Fellow and past program mentor. Robin also writes a weekly blog called The Relentless School Nurse. And without further ado, we will let Robin take us through a presentation on amplifying the voices of nurses on social media.
Well, I am so thrilled to be here on Not Just a Nurse Day. This is a huge honor, and I am excited to talk about why we must be using our voices. I can't think of a better thing to do than talk about the voice of the voice of nursing, and amplifying the voice of nursing through using social media. So that's why I'm here today, to tell you my social media story and why I started a blog called The Relentless School Nurse, and how I want to encourage other nurses across the states, really across the world, to speak up because our voices are so important. So I love to start with this quote. Envision how things would be if the voice and visibility of the nursing profession were commiserate with the size and importance of the nursing profession. Honestly, this one quote truly drives my work. Interestingly enough, Burrish and Gordon, who wrote From Silence to Voice, and I would recommend all nurses read this, are not nurses. And I wonder to myself, what would this book look like if it were written by nurses? So one of the reasons I started my blog, The Relentless School Nurse, was to amplify the voice of school nursing through telling stories from my health office. I think all nurses have this sense that nobody understands what we do. And truthfully, in school nursing, I think we are the true unicorns of nursing, because nobody really understands what a school nurse does. And what I wanted to do with my blog and my presence on social media was really to tell stories and share examples of what school nurses actually do in our everyday work. I was tired of seeing articles about highlighting ice packs and head lice and band-aids and portraying school nursing as a retirement job. So kind of stumbled into blogging. I had always thought about doing it, but I stumbled into it a little bit, and I dipped my toe into it, and I was absolutely caught up in how powerful not just blogging is, but social media, and eventually telling other people's stories. But I have to say, there is one study out there that I read that completely changed my nursing practice, and it's called the Woodhull Revisited Study. Some of you may have never heard of it, but I encourage you all to look it up, because the study was a repeat of an original study done in 1997. In 1997, Nancy Woodhull, who actually was one of the founding editors of USA Today, herself had a health crisis, and she saw the work that nurses did. Now, so she had this medical issue that really impacted her life. She was also in the news media, and she began to wonder why nurses were not more present in news media stories. And so in 1997, a study was done to look at the voices of nurses as primary sources in news-related media stories. And honestly, the numbers were dismal. In 1997, 4% of nurses were used as the primary source in news-related media stories. There was much more to the study, but I just want to give you a little bit of glimpse of what happened. The study was actually repeated 20 years later. And unbelievably, that number actually decreased. Now, because there is that 2% statistical significance, uh, it, it is not actually it's not actually lower because they give this 2% kind of leeway. So the truth is nothing much happened between 1997 and 2017 when the study was repeated in terms of nurses being used as primary sources in healthcare news stories. Not nurses, not nurses as the topic of the story, but nurses used to inform the story. That's really the impact of this study. So spoiler alert, nothing has happened. So what is the issue? Is it that nurses are unheard or that we're not putting our voices out there? And it really made me wonder. And it also drove my desire to amplify nursing, what I could do from my corner of the world. And that's really the story of my work in social media. So Barbara Glickstein, who said this quote, I actually met her on Twitter, and she's now a very dear friend of mine. And her guidance and her understanding of nursing media competencies is just fascinating. And it really is something that we need to start looking at in our nursing education programs. It's just not happening yet. So I decided to do my own little cursory look to see my own very unscientific study of what school nursing stories are, because I am a school nurse and I wanted to see what people were saying about school nurses. And boy, was I frustrated. These are actual headlines from stories about school nurses. Now remember, not that the school nurse was necessarily used to inform the story, but also about school nurses. So what did I find? School nurses do more than bandage boo-boos. School nurses provide more than Band-Aids. School nurses are more than just Band-Aids. These are actual headlines. School nurses give out more than just Band-Aids. The problem is that when we say what we don't do, people don't hear that. People hear that school nurses equals Band-Aids, school nurses equals head lice, school nurses equals ice packs. And it's very frustrating, and it's not true. So all of this kind of grounded my work in amplifying the voice of school nursing. I do have some good news though. Just yesterday, I started another kind of look back to see if anything had changed just in terms of school nursing. And this time I found some really promising headlines. Just yesterday, I found all of these. Medical issues handled by school nurses double since the 90s. Awesome headline. The nurse is in. School health professionals evolve to meet students' needs. And school nurse provides critical role, a school committee is told. So these are just small examples of how maybe the tide is turning. And I have to say, I really do think if we do another look back in 20 years from now, hopefully we're going to find some different outcomes from the Woodhull study. But I wanted people to understand what school nurses really do. And that's why I started my blog. This is really what happens in a school health office. We deal with the most wicked problems of society, the most complicated ones. We deal with students who are abused and hungry, pregnant, sad, bullying, homeless. We are the link between home and school, and those social determinants of health that impact all of our world, they come to school every day with our kids. And I wanted people to understand the impact of really what school nurses do. It's a pretty riveting illustration. And this is my why. So I think it's important for all of us to know what our why is. I say that, I call myself a relentless school nurse because truthfully, that's what it takes to care for these students and families with the complex health, emotional, and social needs. I've been a school nurse for 19 years in Camden, New Jersey. It's an urban school district. It's only 13 miles from my house, but truthfully, a world away from where I live. 37% of my families live below the poverty level in the city where I serve. And there's a 10-year gap in life expectancy. So the two zip codes, truthfully, between where I live and where I work, they tell the story of impact. They tell the story of the impact of privilege versus poverty. And I also do not look like the students that I serve, and that is something that I'm reminded of every day. So I walk in cultural humility in my work. Um, Sometimes I honestly feel like Lillian Wald. I'm working with students who are new immigrants who have their immigration status is very questionable. There's complications regarding homelessness and hunger and transportation issues and all of the social determinants of health that impact our world and impact these children. And so this is the world that I work in. These are the children that I serve, and I couldn't be more proud to work with them. There's Lillian right in that picture. So it's always important to know your why. It keeps me going. But knowing my why and working within social media, I wanted to say to myself, why should a nurse use Twitter? You know, what is important about putting our information out there? I think sometimes, you know, we are certainly socialized as nurses to not always use our voices, but that hasn't served us well. In America, anyway, there's 4 million nurses and 1 million physicians. So when you look at the Woodhull study, which was based in the States, and you see that now only 2% of nurses are used as primary source in a health-related news story, but yet there's 4 million of us, where are we? So that really drove my decision to start using social media. So here's a fun slide. Should you use social media? So you start with, do you live in the 21st century? Yes, there it is. You need to use social media. And it's actually backed up by evidence. So as nurses and academics, this is a brand new article that just came out. It's called To Tweet or Not to Tweet, an argument for nursing presence in the Twitter sphere. As nurses and academics, we have a duty to engage the public through Twitter and embrace this technology as a means to improve our work and enhance our impact. So there is our permission, not that we even needed it. But it's good to see that in a nursing ethics journal, using Twitter is being promoted. I wanted to share that with you. The other thing I wanted to share is the potential of social media in nursing. And I have to tell you that our friends in the UK have this down to a science. We nurses, the @ we nurses, they are to me the Twitter geniuses of the nursing world. And this is their slide. So unlocking the potential of social media in nursing. I'm just going to go through it rather quickly with you, but there are 4 reasons to use social media in nursing. First of all, sharing your nursing practice. It is a global platform. Clearly, I would not be on this summit if I had not been identified as somebody who uses Twitter and happens to be a nurse. So it is an absolutely global summit. It is easy to use, it is accessible, and it raises the profile of nurses and nursing organizations. Social media to inform your nursing practice. I would have never found out about the Woodhull study if it had not been for Twitter. So I learn, reflect, you find other nurses who are resources, look for research opportunities. You're going to see through my presentation today that all of these things have happened for me just because I've used social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and other social media platforms. Another reason to use social media as part of your nursing practice, and probably my favorite one, is that expertise are at our fingertips. We can ask questions, we can network, we can meet people. In fact, just Thursday night, I met 3 other nurses that I had never met in person before, who were on Twitter, who happened to live across the bridge from me in Philadelphia, and we met for dinner. We had the most amazing conversation, and it was only because we had met on Twitter, and we realized that we were nurses, we were innovators, and we wanted to meet in person, because as wonderful as social media is, there is nothing like a face-to-face connection. So connecting with people, and connecting with people we care for, is another reason. And then people connect with each other. The other reason, which I think is maybe one of the ones that we're not as good at, is celebrating our nursing practice. We can celebrate what we do. It is not selfish. It is not self-aggrandizing. It is actually important that we share our nursing successes. We are not bragging. It is not boastful. We're actually educating people. And that's part of our mission. It's part of the ethics of being a nurse. You know, our mandate is caring, education, and to me, using social media for those reasons is absolutely part and parcel of being a nurse. The other thing it does is that when we share our successes and when we share what nursing practice really means, we're also letting the public know what we do. And we want the public to understand nursing. We have a complicated field. There are so many niche pieces of nursing that we within our own field of nursing don't always get what each other does. So it's important that we speak to each other, but it's equally important that we speak outside of nursing as well. So if you get a chance, go to We Nurses and you will learn. They even have something called Twitterversity. So it's like a Twitter university, and they just have phenomenal resources there. Oops. There we go. So why advocate? I have to say, I'd rather use the word activism. It does sometimes send people off in other directions. So I'm going to use the word advocate, but for those of you who can hear the word activism, I'd rather use that one. But it's because we care. So I love this from Dr. Seuss. Unless someone like you cares an awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And so that's one of the main reasons that I use my voice for, I call myself a school nurse activist because that's what I do. I'm having a little trouble. There we go. So why advocate? What does it mean? So advocacy is influencing. It's not confrontational and it's informative. I think the confrontational piece is where people maybe have some misunderstanding. When I use Twitter and people come back at me for some of the issues that I am very passionate about, especially about gun violence prevention, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, I don't try to sway people to my opinion. That's not why I use Twitter. Actually, I often use the block button because I don't want to get into arguments with people. I want to share research, share resources, share evidence, share stories. I feel like we learn from hearing each other's stories. And when you connect evidence to a story, you remember it more. So I'm not confrontational. I don't think advocacy should be confrontational. I want to inform. I want to educate. I guess ultimately that is influencing. But you have to be careful because out there on social media, anything that you put out there, of course, stays there. So there's different kinds of use for social media. There's personal use where you share photos of food and holidays and family and friends and on Facebook and Instagram, and that is all great. There's also official use of social media where a company or organization presents their brand and then shares that information online. And then there's professional use of social media. And that's what I use Twitter and Facebook and my blog for. It's based on your area of expertise and interest. And you use social media, it allows you to share information and interact with other individuals and organizations that have similar interests. But again, you have to be careful. We're not going to share, you know, personal medical information, anything that could identify a patient, or in my case, a student, anything that would violate confidentiality. You have to know your organization's rules and regulations. You have to be careful, and truthfully, if you don't want it on the front page of the New York Times, whoops, wait a minute, sorry guys. There you go. If you don't want it on the front page of the New York Times, don't put it out there. That's my rule of thumb. Don't put it out there. Try not to put things out there when you're feeling reactive or angry. That's different than feeling passionate, but you do have to be careful sometimes. There have been nurses that have gotten into trouble. But I also think they use that, oh, you're going to get in trouble line to stop people from speaking up. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, you know, use discernment. And we know, just stop and take a breath and say, is this helpful? And if you find it helpful, go for it, because that's what we need to use our advocacy voice. This is the time of any time in my many, many decades of life to use my voice, it is now. So that's what I'm doing. So let me tell you some stories of what has happened to me through the use of social media. And I hope that you'll understand through my storytelling that there's nothing extraordinary about anything that I did. There have been some extraordinary outcomes, but my story is not extraordinary. Everybody has a story. And what I think is most interesting is when we as nurses tell our stories, share them, activate from them, and encourage other people to share their stories too. So let me tell you a story about how I met this woman in this picture with these adorable Muppets. So I was on LinkedIn, and I found this amazing picture. I did not know who the woman was. I do love Muppets, and I'm a preschool nurse, so I especially love Muppets. And the story was about a new part of Sesame Street called Sesame Street and Communities. And it really grabbed me. The headline grabbed me, the picture grabbed me, and I started to read about this really interesting initiative that Sesame Street and Communities was doing. They are the educational arm of Sesame Workshop, and Sesame Street and Communities had just released um, an entire initiative around adverse childhood experiences, around trauma, and they were looking at things like homelessness, violence, all of these things that were completely and directly impacting my own students. And so I wrote to the person in this picture a private message on LinkedIn, and I told her about work that I was doing in my community. It's called a community cafe, and we had been working with parents who had been overutilizing the emergency room for non-emergent care, and I wanted to share the success that we had had with that. And honestly, I didn't ever expect to hear back from her. But about a week later, she wrote back to me and she asked me for more information about the project that I had shared with her. And I said immediately, as soon as I saw it, I sent her a link to a video about our community cafe project. And within a few seconds, she wrote back to me and we got into a LinkedIn private conversation. Well, it turned out that she is the senior vice president of Sesame Workshop. Her name is Dr. Jeanette Bentoncourt, and she was stuck on a train. Her train was broken down, and truthfully, she had nothing to do for the next hour but chat with me about what it means to be a school nurse, what I do in my community, and what did I need. Before I knew it, she had sent me 400 books for my students. Every single student in my school district that I am responsible for, and every single teacher got a book about Julia. Julia is a Muppet who has autism. So I shared, this is a picture of my kids reading the Julia story. So of course, what did I do? But I shared it on social media. And they were thrilled and I was thrilled and the kids were thrilled. And I was just very moved by her incredible generosity. But the story does not end there. Let's see what happens next. The next thing I knew, I was chosen to become a Sesame hero, which was so thrilling for me. They posted my picture on Sesame Street and Communities and Facebook, and I was very honored. And they talked about my community cafe project. And the best part of the whole thing is that I began to develop a connection with Jeanette Bentoncourt, and we had a really interesting discussion because from her place of a very high position in Sesame Street, she'd been there almost 30 years, I think, she had never thought about the role of the school nurse in preschool. And it gave her something to think about. Not only did it give her something to think about, but she took action. She wanted to have a more formal relationship with my national organization, the National Association of School Nurses. And so I linked Dr. Betancourt to the leadership of my national association, because I am involved in my association. I do believe we all should be. They represent us, and we have influence over what happens in our national associations as well. And the next thing you know, Dr. Betancourt is our keynote speaker at our national conference in 2018. So that was really awesome. I got to meet her in person. She gave this incredible talk about Sesame Street and Community and the amazing work that they're doing, and how we can work as school nurses together with them. And now Sesame Street and Communities and NASN, our national organization, they actually have a more formal relationship, which is really exciting. That brought me all the way to Sesame Street. I actually got to go in person and meet them and talk about bringing some of these resources to my community in Camden, New Jersey, which we are working on, and I'm really thrilled to be able to do that. The next wonderful thing that happened was that Jeanette and I joined together and we wrote an article. Sesame Street and School Nurses Join in a Circle of Care. So this is one story of how one outreach on LinkedIn, I just took a chance and saw a really interesting article and shared something in common with, hopefully, with this person. And she was so professionally generous. She wrote back, and the rest was history. But that's one example of many, and I'm just one person. Imagine if all nurses followed kind of a path that way, the impact that we could have and the change that we could make. So everything, though, changed for me personally on February 14th, 2018, which was the day that the school shooting happened in Parkland, Florida. And just to give you some background, my family, very tragically, has had now 2 mass shootings. Uh, and both of my family members survived. But to have 2 mass shootings in one family that happened 70 years apart activated me like no other issue could. So on February 14th, 2018 at 2:25 p.m., my phone rang, and it was my sister. Now, my sister is an art teacher in Florida. My niece is a Parkland student. And my sister said that there was an active shooter in Carly's school and that she was hiding in a closet. We knew that Carly was okay at that moment. What we didn't know, that 17 others were dead, and, and the devastation that Parkland has left behind, is the ripple effects is still happening. But for my family, this was even more impactful. And this is actually a tweet from Carly the next day, February 15th. Carly writes, "This is my grandpa. When he was 12 years old, he hid in a closet while his family was murdered during the first mass shootings in America. Almost 70 years later, I also hid in a closet from a murderer. These events shouldn't be repetitive. Something has to change." So at that moment, I just knew. I was so stunned. I was thankful Carly was alive. I was devastated for the loss that was happening, that I knew was going to happen as this horror unfolded. And I promised my sister and my niece that I would do everything I could from my public health perspective to find answers to this, unfortunately, tragically, right now, uniquely American problem. So right after the Parkland shootings, the American Academy of Nursing took some action, and I was really glad about that. And they wrote a letter to Congress asking, or actually demanding, that a national commission on mass shooting should be formed within 30 days of what happened in Parkland. So just a few days after Parkland, the American Academy of Nursing called for a national commission on mass shootings for the American Congress to take this up, and they gave them like a 30-day window. And I was so moved. I was so proud of the Academy that they would take that stand. I decided to follow up with my congressman to find out where he stood on this. Was he going to be part of this commission? At this moment, at this point, I was doing everything possible I could to amplify this issue. I was, as a school nurse in a community where there's tremendous gun violence, as an aunt of my precious niece who had just survived the most horrific incident, and certainly as a daughter of my father, who, when he was 12 years old, lost his entire family, I had no choice but to use my voice. So I reached out to my Congressman, Donald Norcross, and their office had not heard anything about this event or this request. And so I somehow got on their radar, which I'll tell you about what happened a little bit later. But I started writing. At that point, I had already started my blog, and of course, my blog took a major turn left, and I spent So at that point, my blog took a major turn. I started focusing specifically on gun violence prevention. I had made this promise to my sister and my niece that I would do everything in my power to bring attention to the issue of gun violence as a public health crisis, because clearly that's what it is. And so I reached out to my congressman. I got on his radar because I wanted to make sure that he was going to support this commission, and I started, uh, focusing my blogs on my family history, what happened with my niece, how, we must do something from a public health perspective, that this issue belongs in the healthcare arena, that it really, nothing has been done in 20 years to address gun violence. I mean, we had the Sandy Hook shooting that killed 27 people, including more than 20 children who were 5 and 6 years old. And anyway, I can just go on and on about this issue, but this was what was framing my activism. So as I promised my sister and my niece that I would do everything in my power to address gun violence prevention from a public health perspective, my blog posts were reflecting that. And a very professionally generous colleague, and I wish, if there's one message in all of this, is let's be professionally generous colleagues to each other, because you never know where your professional generosity will lead another one of your colleagues. So pass it forward is my big message. But a professionally generous colleague took my blog posts and forwarded it to the new dean of my nursing school. Now understand, I am a full-time school nurse. But I also teach, I'm on faculty at the Rutgers Camden University School of Nursing. I teach in the school nurse certificate program. So I am adjunct faculty. We had a brand new dean who had not even started. She also happens to be the editor of Nursing Economics. And in her professional generosity, she is also a believer in nurses using our voices. She invited me to write a guest editorial for Nursing Economics, and I called it Why I Became a School Nurse Activist. And I have to tell you, from that one editorial, so many doors opened. So another message I think I'd love to share is put your thoughts down on paper. Not everything we have to write has to be a scientific journal. We can also write letters to the editor. We can write op-eds. We can write opinion pieces. We can write about things that impact our patients, our families, our community. Our voices are important. So I was very fortunate that Donna Nikitas invited me to write this best editorial, and I then really began to share it quite widely on Twitter, and it really truly has opened many doors outside of nursing. And that's another interesting part of this whole journey, is that my work is now crossed over beyond the world of nursing, which I think is important for all of us to consider as we go on this journey of amplifying the voice of nursing. One of the things that also happened, remember I talked about reaching out to my congressman. He reached back out to me a few weeks later, and he asked if Carly, that's my niece in the picture, and I would participate in a town hall talking about gun violence. And we did. Carly and I teamed up together. She Skyped in from Florida. It was held in a high school in a small town near me, and we had about 300 people in the audience, and we talked about the impact of gun violence. I told the story, my family's story. Carly told the story of what it felt like to be in that building, hiding in a classroom, having to be freed by the SWAT team, thinking of her grandfather. It was a very powerful night. And it solidified a relationship between Congressman Donald Norcross and my family. Donald Norcross then went on to be part of passing something called HR 8, which is a background check bill, universal background check bill. And I'm just going to play this very quick, only a minute long clip of when Donald Norcross cast his vote for this bill and what he said.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm here to tell a story about gun violence that spans multiple generations and it started in my hometown of Camden City, New Jersey. The tragic event happened in Camden in 1949. Howard Ungress shot and killed 13 people. This event is now considered the first modern mass shooting in our country's history. During those horrific events that unfolded, a 12-year-old boy hid in the closet as his mother and father were slaughtered. His name was Charles Cogan, and nearly 70 years later, in a school in Parkland, Florida, his own granddaughter, Carly Novell, hid in a closet just like her grandfather did. Carly is with us today to see how true democracy works. And I'll end with Carly's words. She said, "This pain shouldn't be generational." She's right. It shouldn't have happened. And we must do more for our children, for our grandchildren, for everyone in the community. Thank you.
That was powerful. I'm so appreciative. And Donald Norcross dedicated his vote to my father's memory. So back to Twitter. Of course, I wanted to thank him for presenting our family story on the floor of the Congress. And this is just an example of a tweet between he and I. And he thanked us for entrusting him to tell our story about, and when he voted for the gun safety legislation, he did dedicate his vote in my memory. So that just moves me even when I speak about it today. So my work continued. I felt that, we needed to hear from the community as well. And I happened to work in an urban school district where my students are impacted daily by community violence. And I wanted to know what they felt about gun violence in their community. So with the help of another nurse that I met on Twitter who had a brilliant idea of having students paint desks, started a project called #NoMoreEmptyDesks. I reached out to an art teacher that I've worked with for many years. Now remember, I'm now a preschool nurse, so this is reaching out to colleagues that I hadn't worked with in a while. And we started this #NoMoreEmptyDesks project. This is an example of one of the best pictures, pretty impactful. Student paint. So I knew I needed to do something for my school community. I work in an urban district. I shared a little bit about my district earlier in this talk. My students experience community gun violence on a regular basis. In fact, this school year alone, we lost 4 students to community gun violence. 2 of them had been prior students of mine, and 1 was killed on the way home from school. I mean, this is a major issue. And unfortunately, in urban districts, and children, Black and brown children, do not get the same focus as the school shootings that are happening typically in suburban districts in the United States. So I wanted to do something to really focus on how my students felt about community gun violence and what could we do. Because I also believe that our community members are the experts in their lives. And just like my community cafe project showed, we need to ask our members, our students, their parents, they can come up with community-based solutions. So we started a movement called #NoMoreEmptyDesks. I had read an article, the number has gone up exponentially, but the article said at that time that there were 26,000 empty desks lost to students who died from gun violence from Columbine, which was in 1999 to 2016. Truthfully, that number is now 39,000 students, not only killed at school, but killed. Children who were like 0 to 18. That number astounded me, and I kept thinking about empty desks in school buildings and how they represented children who were no longer there because they were dead from bullet holes. And it just enraged me, but I needed to take action because honestly, being enraged is not a strategy to get anything done. So we started the #NoMoreEmptyDesks project, and I reached out to a really dear friend who's also an art teacher And this picture that you see, I saved a seat for you, is one of the desks that was painted. The young man in the background is the artist that painted it. So I'm going to take you just a quick view to show you what happened with one idea and how it grew. So here was a tweet that I sent. I wanted the project to get some traction. It's such a great project, and I wanted other people to know about it. So I reached out to something called Tap Into Camden, which is a community-based online newspaper. And I talked to them about that I was a Camden school nurse, and we were doing this project at the high school, and hopefully they'd be interested in it. The next thing I knew, I continued to share as the project progressed. You'll see there's 3 different desks. The one on the bottom right that says Camden High was painted for a student that had died on his way home from school from gun violence, and his teacher found out about the project and asked these students at a different school if they would paint a desk for her. So I kept tweeting about it. Here's the teacher in the middle who took on this wonderful project at just because I asked her to, and she said yes, and these kids got so much out of participating in it. And here are 2 of the artists. You never know where things may lead. The next thing I knew, the Philadelphia Inquirer, which was one of our larger papers, contacted us and did a wonderful story about not just about me, because I really wanted to be the background of the story. I wanted them to talk about what is happening in urban communities, how gun violence is impacting students. But I think because of my family history, and it just turns out, interestingly enough, that Melanie Burney, who's the writer of this article, had interviewed my father decades ago about his life story. So there was that connection. We had actually met many, many years prior. But anyway, she did this wonderful article called Art for Life. And it really was so exciting for the students, for us to be part of this really interesting process of having something, an idea come to fruition and then get some media attention around it. So it was really exciting for us. The really interesting thing that just happened last month, September 16th. The Woodhull study that I talked to you about was housed at the George Washington University School of Nursing in their health policy division. And they wanted to promote journalists who did stories about nurses. And it's so fascinating, but the writer of the article that I just showed you, how Project Targets Deadly Gun Violence Awareness in Camden, Melanie Burney, she was actually nominated. I have no idea who nominated her. I didn't even know about the article. I wouldn't have known about the article, but I saw it on Twitter. And she's one of the runners-up for the inaugural Nursing Journalism Award that they just announced. So that was like full circle, that was a pretty cool thing that happened. The other thing I did was I was very intentional about reaching outside of nursing. And if there's one major message I would like to get across from this talk today, is that nurses do a phenomenal job of talking to each other. That is called inward facing. We are fabulous at it. What we are not so fabulous at is talking outside of our nursing profession. And so Joseph Saccharin is a physician. He's a trauma surgeon who, when he was, I think he was 16, he was in high school, he was at his high school football game and a fight broke out, and he, as a bystander, was shot in the throat. He almost died. And that experience led him in his adult life to become a trauma surgeon. I reached out to him on Twitter, and we became Twitter friends around this work. Sharing stories with each other, just like retweeting each other's things, just getting to know each other on Twitter. This Is My Lane initiative happened because the NRA, the National Rifle Association, posted a very highly critical tweet about physicians needing to stay in their lane because what do they know about gun violence? And it created this barrage of physicians and other healthcare professionals explaining exactly how gun violence and the aftermath and the effects of gun violence is everybody's lane. So this is part of this whole movement of This Is My Lane. And Dr. Saccharin made me one of these. This is my lane. I told you that story about the more than 26,000 school deaths that empty from gun violence. It's actually now 39,000 because that only went up to 2016. And so I was really proud to be part of this campaign, that this is our lane campaign, and through the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence. So that's been floating around on Twitter a bit. And then from all of this work, I was invited to participate as truly, I think, one of the first nurses on the advisory council for AFFIRM research. It's the American Foundation of Firearm Injury Reduction in Medicine. And it is a research think tank. It's also a funding source for researchers who are interested in gun violence prevention research. And so I'm very honored to be on their advisory board. The very first meeting that they had was in Chicago last February. And believe it or not, CBS Sunday Morning was present to film this meeting. So it was filmed in February. This is actually a little bit of what CBS Sunday Morning said. I'm just going to play a couple minutes, like less than a minute of it. Whoops. Sorry. Here we go.
A coalition of medical professionals who argue stopping gun violence very much in their lane is likely to grow even more determined. The aftermath of violence has brought two American cities, first yesterday, then early this morning. Our cover story is reported by Dr. John.
It happened again.
I heard do, and then it went do.
Twice in less than 24 hours.
People just started bolting straight into the store in order to get to cover.
Are any of us surprised? Can anybody help? Within the last week, who here has seen a gunshot victim?
I think people think that if the look gets impossible, that there's magic there. Sometimes it's just too much for us.
If there was ever a time for preventive medicine, it's now, says this group of doctors.
So it is a group of doctors, but there's also nurses in there. And I'm happy to say, I'm proud to say I'm one of them. Also, the National Emergency Room Nurse Association is now part of AFFIRM, and my own National Association of School Nurses is now part of AFFIRM. And on my piece, I honestly believe that would have never happened had I not taken a stand and asked, please, please support this organization. It took a little bit of time, but one person can make a huge difference. So I was very proud to be part of, I am very proud to be part of this organization. I have to say, what was really interesting about this piece, it was filmed in February of 2019, but they didn't show it until August. They didn't show it until we in America had two back-to-back mass shootings in August, one in El Paso, Texas, and one in Dayton, Ohio, with less than 24 hours of each other. So that says a lot. So really, from all of these just amazing experiences I have had because of social media, and I can't stress that enough, I was tapped to speak at the Future of Nursing 2030, which is something, it was an incredible privilege and honor, and it is a committee that looks at nursing and the needs of nursing and predicts, based on evidence, what nursing will need to grow into the next decade. So I was truly honored, not just to speak I was honored to speak, but the fact that they asked me to represent school nursing was my highest honor, because school nurses are not always part of these conversations. And I think what's happening now, and I have to say, I really do think it's because of social media, and we're much more out there present. I'm hoping, you know, maybe the Relentless School Nurse blog has helped move that conversation forward, that school nursing was at the table, and we have not been in the past. So I'm really proud. If I had anything to do with making that connection, then I feel really good about this work. Here is just a little snippet of what I said that day.
Well, I so appreciate being here, and I'm thrilled to talk about school nursing, my absolutely favorite topic. Let me tell you a story. This was a 4-year-old preschool girl stuffing her school lunch into her pants pocket instead of eating at school. This same little girl refuses to eat her breakfast or afternoon snack because she says she's saving her food for home. Her family escaped a dangerous Central American country and traveled for more than a year on foot to seek asylum here. The school administrator called and asked, "How can we help this family?" I thought to myself, how can we help a traumatized family assimilate into a foreign country with nothing but they carried on their backs? It's a big question, and it's one that repeats itself in my school community and many others across the country. I am a school nurse, a relentless one, because that is what it takes to care for students and families with complex health and social needs. Takes to.
Sorry. So that is the message. I was given 15 minutes, and I couldn't go over. I might have gone over a little bit, and it was a very powerful moment because school nurses have not been at this big table at the Future of Nursing, the National Academy of Medicine, and I feel really good about the message. It was very well received. And in fact, what happened next was quite interesting. Hopefully I can move to the next slide. Yeah. So the Future of Nursing led me to be invited to speak at a press conference by Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, who is a nurse from Illinois. And what happened was her person in her office called the Academy of Nursing because Lauren Underwood wanted to do a press conference around the impact of gun violence in school. I know there are people all over the world on this call, and you know, I'm sorry to say that this is the issue that is impacting the United States the most, which is why I'm, you know, sharing it with you. But it is a public health crisis in our country. And so what happened was, miraculously, the person who they spoke to at the academy, who happened to have been the CEO, had been present at the Future of Nursing, and she heard my talk, and she connected us. She gave them my name, and she connected me to Congresswoman Underwood's office, and I was invited to speak at the press conference that just happened 2 weeks ago. So this is a picture of us on Capitol Hill, and this is a letter that they sent explaining, you know, what was happening when the press conference was. And here's a teeny little snippet of that press conference.
My name is Lauren Underwood, and I'm a nurse representing 14 Illinois. Across Northern Illinois, I'm served with gun violence is having on our children. As a nurse, I know that gun violence itself is a public health epidemic. I also know that active shooter drills and the threat of gun violence in schools is affecting the well-being of children. Since April of 1999, 187,000 students have been exposed to gun violence.
So the press conference included, I spoke after Congresswoman Underwood, and then 2 children spoke, which was so powerful. The little girl, the youngest girl, spoke about being in an active shooter drill and how traumatizing and scary it was. And the older girl spoke about being in a lockdown because there was gun violence happening outside of her school. Also, Lucy McBath, Congresswoman Lucy McBath spoke. She used her grief of losing her son to gun violence by running for Congress. So, I mean, you know, she's just a national hero as far as I'm concerned. The president of the academy spoke, Dr. Karen Cox, and a teacher spoke who also is a congresswoman, Johanna Haynes, who represents the state of Connecticut. So this was, talk about democracy in action. We were outside of the Capitol, you know, messy, people are walking by. I just never felt more alive in terms of being able to use my voice in such a really impactful way. And truly, of all the days of my nursing career, and there have been 35 years of them, this is number 1 and number 2 day for me as a nurse. And now I'm here. So I am thrilled to have been able to participate. I hope that my story inspires you to use your voice, tell your story, reach back out to me if you're interested in being a guest blogger on the Relentless School Nurse. I'm so thankful to be able to share my story, and I hope that our paths will cross. And thank you so much, Amy, for inviting me.